Afternoon at a high-tech headquarters in San Francisco. A boardroom on the 40th floor. Massive screens display live system data. Daniel Brooks, 41, stands in the back. He's just a contract technician, called in for temporary support. At the head of the table sits Elena Whitmore, the 27-year-old CEO. The meeting is tense. The system is slowing down. Customers are complaining. Daniel looks at the monitor. He whispers, "This isn't a server issue." A manager smirks. "Then what is it?" Elena snaps, "If you have something useful, say it. Otherwise, don't interrupt." Laughter follows. But then, the phone rings. Watch. Daniel Brooks was a man of steel, silence, and absolute rhythmic routine. At 41, his face was a map of quiet focus and the deep, enduring weariness of a man who worked two lives, one to keep the digital world running and one to keep a small home safe. He was a freelance systems engineer, a ghost architect who stepped into companies for 3-month contracts to patch holes and stabilize legacy networks. He didn't have a permanent office with a view of the Golden Gate Bridge. He didn't have a corporate ID that granted him access to the executive gym or the gourmet cafeteria. He was the man in the simple blue polo shirt who sat at a folding table in the corner of the humid IT lab, surrounded by tangled fiber optic cables and half-empty cups of cold coffee. Daniel chose this life by design, a deliberate retreat from the spotlight. He was a single father to 9-year-old Emma. 5 years ago, his world had been surgically hollowed out when his wife passed away in a sudden accident. Since that day, Daniel had systematically dismantled his old high-pressure career at a global security firm. He didn't want the 60-hour weeks, the red-eye flights to London, or the international summits anymore. He needed a life with a hard stop, a life that allowed him to be at the school gate at 3 p.m. and on the sofa for bedtime stories about space explorers at 8 p.m. He traded the prestige of a VP title for the flexibility of a contractor because his daughter's laughter was the only currency he cared about. His resume, if anyone bothered to read it, was a masterpiece of technical achievement. He had been the lead architect for 3 of the largest payment gateways in North America. He understood the logic of flow better than most CEOs understood their own stock prices. He could hear the vibration of a failing server before the diagnostic software even registered a spike. But to the executives at Whitmore Tech, Daniel was essentially invisible. He was a line item in the temporary staffing budget, a human utility like the electricity or the water. They saw a man who arrived on a dusty bicycle, a man who wore off-the-brand clothes, and they assumed he lacked the killer instinct. In their world, if you weren't constantly climbing the ladder, you were standing still. The company was currently on a war footing. They were 2 weeks away from a major public offering, an IPO that would value them at billions, and their primary platform, an automated trading interface, was starting to lag. Elena Whitmore, the CEO, was a phenom who had inherited the company at 25 and turned it into a billion-dollar beast. She was brilliant, decisive, and notoriously ruthless. She viewed her company as a perfect machine, and she had no patience for friction or anyone who didn't speak the language of high-stakes disruption. On this particular afternoon, the boardroom was a pressure cooker of collective anxiety. The air conditioning hummed, but it couldn't cool the heat of the arguments bouncing off the glass walls. Elena was demanding to know why the system response time had increased by 0.5 seconds. To a layman, it was a blink of an eye. To Elena, it was a fundamental failure that would cost her millions in investor confidence. She paced the floor like a predator, her eyes scanning the room for someone to blame. Daniel had been called into the room simply to handle the audio-visual feed for a high-priority presentation. He stood in the far corner, his tablet open, monitoring the back-end logs as a matter of professional habit. He saw the spikes. He saw the way the data was pooling in the distribution layer, like water hitting a blocked pipe. He saw a catastrophic collapse starting to form in the logic gates, not because the servers were weak, but because the routing protocol was stuck in a feedback loop. When he whispered, "This isn't a server issue," he wasn't trying to be a hero or disrupt the hierarchy. He was simply stating a diagnostic fact that was blindingly obvious to him. But in a room full of Ivy League directors and high-paid consultants, the voice of a temporary technician was an unwelcome intrusion. Elena's dismissal wasn't just cold. It was calculated to remind everyone in the room of their place. She looked at him as if he were a bug in the code that needed to be deleted from the system. Daniel didn't argue. He didn't defend his past or his expertise. He simply stepped back into the shadows, merging with the wallpaper. He had a taco night with Emma in 3 hours, and to him that was far more important than Elena's ego. But as he looked at the screens, he saw the timer on the logic loop reach its terminal state. He knew the machine was about to stop breathing. He knew the silence was coming. In a real work environment, the person with the most valuable answer is often the one we choose to ignore. We measure intelligence by titles and status, forgetting that the most profound insights usually come from the people who are actually touching the tools. Being right doesn't always mean being heard. It just means you're the one who has to watch the crash. The phone on the massive mahogany conference table rang with a sharp, insistent chirp that seemed to vibrate the very glass of the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lead systems engineer, a man named Marcus who had been boasting about his unbeatable load balance strategy just moments ago, picked up. As he listened to the voice on the other end, the color drained from his face until he was the same shade of gray as the office walls. "The payment gateway just went dark," Marcus whispered, his voice cracking like dry wood. "Total synchronization failure. Transactions are hanging in the buffer. The London market just opened, and we're reporting a 100% error rate. It's a total blackout." The silence in the room was absolute for 3 seconds. Then it was replaced by a frantic, high-decibel panic that felt like a physical weight. Elena Whitmore stood up, her jaw set in a hard, clinical line that masked the terror in her chest. "Restart the cloud nodes. Now! Switch to the backup database in Virginia. I don't care about the cost. Just get us back online." The engineering team scrambled. The sound of frantic typing filled the room like a hailstorm on a tin roof. They were following the standard protocol for a server failure, the one they had practiced 1,000 times. They were treating the symptom, not the cause. They assumed that because the system was down, the engine must be broken. They didn't realize that the engine was fine. The road was just missing. Daniel stood in the back, leaning against the doorframe, watching the disaster unfold with a calm that was almost eerie. He saw the red warnings on the screens multiplying. He saw the Virginia switchover fail because the routing error had already replicated to the backup. The experts were currently pouring more water into a bucket that had no bottom, and they were doing it at 1,000,000 miles an hour. "It's not working," Marcus shouted, his fingers blurring across the keys in a desperate dance. "The Virginia node is rejecting the handshake. The logic is self-looping. We're losing data integrity. If we don't stop the loop, we're going to brick the entire infrastructure permanently. We're losing the history." Elena walked over to the monitors, her fingers digging so hard into the edge of the mahogany table that her knuckles turned white. "I don't want to hear about why it's failing, Marcus. I want a solution. Every minute we are dark is $100,000 in lost revenue and a death blow to the IPO. We're bleeding out in front of the whole world. Fix it." The atmosphere was toxic. VPs were shouting over each other, blaming the third-party providers, the hardware, the weather, anything but their own strategy. Elena was vibrating with an energy that looked like power, but felt like pure, unadulterated desperation. She was a CEO who had never been told no by a machine, and she didn't know how to handle the silence of a system that refused to respond to her commands. Daniel moved his backpack to his other shoulder. He looked at the clock. 4:15 p.m. Emma was currently in her robotics club, building a small car that would probably run better than the multi-billion-dollar platform in front of him. He looked at Elena. He saw the fear she was trying to hide behind her Ice Queen mask. He saw the girl who had been handed a legacy she was terrified of breaking. He knew she was a builder, and he respected the empire she had created, even if she didn't respect the people who maintained its foundations. He took a slow, grounding breath, the kind he used to take before a high-stakes deployment. He thought about the human signature of a crisis. When the pressure rises, humans react faster than they think. He saw the engineers preparing to run a high-intensity diagnostic script that would likely crash the remaining server nodes permanently. It was a Hail Mary pass in a game they had already lost. Daniel took one deliberate, heavy step forward. He didn't look at the VPs. He didn't look at the security guards. He looked directly at the back-end logs on the secondary monitor, the raw, unfiltered feed that no one else was watching because it wasn't pretty. He saw the fingerprint of the error clearly. It was a ghost packet from a legacy billing node that was overwhelming the new routing layer. It was a conflict he had solved 3 times before in 3 different companies. He realized then that he was the only hope in the building. Not because he was a genius from a movie, but because he was the only one who wasn't panicking. He was the only one who was quiet enough to hear the machine screaming for help. In a real crisis, the loudest voice is usually the most afraid. Most people rush to do something because action feels like progress, even if that action is making the problem worse. True expertise is the ability to stand still in the middle of a fire and find the one valve that needs to be turned. Daniel didn't wait for permission this time. He walked toward the main console, his movements fluid, rhythmic, and entirely unhurried. He didn't shout to get their attention. He didn't use corporate jargon or technical buzzwords to prove he belonged. He simply spoke with a frequency that cut through the noise of the room like a surgical blade. "You're fixing the wrong layer," Daniel said. The shouting stopped instantly. Marcus, the lead engineer, looked up from his keyboard with a look of pure, unadulterated resentment. "Brooks, get back to the coffee station. This isn't a cabling issue. We have a systemic logic collapse. We're in the deep end now, and you're just a lifeguard." Daniel ignored the insult. He looked at Elena, who was standing 3 feet away, her eyes bloodshot. "Ma'am, your engineers are trying to restart the engine while the fuel lines are blocked from the inside. The servers aren't the problem. The routing layer is trapped in an infinite queue. You're trying to clear the house while the front door is locked from the inside. The more power you add, the harder the door stays shut." Elena looked at Daniel. She saw the contract guy she had mocked 20 minutes ago, but she also saw the absolute unshakable calm in his hazel eyes, a calm that didn't match his uniform. She was a woman of data, and right now the data was telling her that her elite team had no idea what was happening. She looked at the red screens and then back at Daniel. "Explain," Elena commanded. Her voice was sharp, but the mockery had been replaced by a desperate curiosity. Daniel pointed to a scrolling log on the secondary screen. "Look at the refresh timestamps on the routing nodes. They aren't timing out, they're duplicating. There is a ghost packet from the legacy billing node that didn't get purged during the last update. It's creating a 0.04 millisecond conflict that is cascading through the failover triggers. The system thinks it's healthy, so it keeps feeding the loop. If you run that diagnostic script Marcus is holding, you're going to force the loop into the master database. You'll lose the integrity of every transaction since yesterday. You'll lose everything." Marcus scoffed, but his hands were visibly shaking now. That's theoretical. We audited the billing node yesterday. The logs were clean." "You audited the surface," Daniel countered, his voice gaining a resonant, authoritative strength that filled the room. "You didn't check the administrative token refresh? Check the 7 p.m. handover logs from yesterday. I saw the lag on my way in this morning. I tried to tell you, but I was told not to interrupt the useful work." The room went deathly silent. Elena turned to Marcus. "Check it, now." Marcus scrolled through the encrypted logs, his face turning from gray to a sickly white. He reached the 7 p.m. timestamp and zoomed in on the millisecond level. There it was, a tiny, microscopic duplication error. It was exactly as Daniel described, a ghost in the machine that had been growing for 24 hours, waiting for a surge to explode. "He's right," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the cooling fans. "The routing layer is choked. We've been pouring data into a blocked pipe for 6 hours." Elena turned to Daniel. She didn't offer a thank you or an apology. She was still a CEO in the eye of a storm. "Fix it." Daniel didn't sit in the leather chair. He didn't touch the mechanical keyboard. He looked at Marcus. "You do it. I'll guide you. You need to manually terminate the queue and reset the failover triggers to an absolute 0 state. Do not use the automated script. You have to do it through the command line to bypass the logic loop." For the next 20 minutes, the unrefined technician transformed the boardroom into a masterclass in infrastructure logic. He dictated the commands with a precision that left the Oxford-trained engineers breathless. He explained the why behind every step, showing them how to bypass the ghost conflict without losing a single transaction. He was the architect, and they were the builders who had finally found a blueprint that worked. Elena watched him from the corner of the room. She noticed the way he moved, the way he didn't even have to look at the technical manual to know the specific hex code for the routing reset. She saw the grease on his hands from an earlier bicycle repair, and then she saw the brilliance of his mind. She realized that Daniel Brooks wasn't just a smart contractor, he was a master of his own reality. He had been hiding his power in the shadows, and she had been too blind to see anything but his polo shirt. The final command was entered. The enter key clicked in the absolute silence. The progress bar reached 100%. The red text on the giant monitors flickered once, then twice, and then turned a steady, beautiful, healthy green. "System stabilized," the computer announced in its calm, digital voice. "Everything is back up and running," a technician shouted, his voice cracking with relief. "The London market is processing. No data loss. The latency is down to 0.01. We're back online. We're saved." The room erupted into a chaos of joy. Engineers were hugging each other, finally breathing after hours of suffocation. But Daniel didn't join the celebration. He didn't look for a handshake. He walked back to the corner, picked up his worn backpack, and checked his watch. 4:45 p.m. "I have to go," Daniel said to no one in particular. "Emma has a science project presentation at 5. I promised I wouldn't be late for the landing." True power isn't the ability to shout. It's the ability to provide the right answer when the world is screaming. Real respect is earned through the consistency of your integrity, not the length of your resume. Daniel wasn't a hero because he saved $1 billion. He was a hero because he was a father who kept his promise to a 9-year-old girl. The silence that met Daniel as he walked toward the door was different than the silence of the hook. This was the silence of a room that had just seen a mountain move. The VPs and directors stood by the windows, their celebratory champagne glasses forgotten in their hands. Elena Whitmore stood in the center of the room, her eyes locked on Daniel's back as he reached for the door handle. She realized then that the most important asset in her billion-dollar company wasn't the code, the contracts, or the high-stakes investors. It was the man in the blue polo shirt who was currently more worried about a science project than an IPO. "Daniel!" Elena called out. Daniel stopped, his hand on the heavy glass door. He turned around, offering a polite, neutral nod. "Yes, Ms. Whitmore? Is there a cable I missed?" Elena walked toward him, her heels silent on the plush carpet now. She stopped 3 feet away, effectively breaking the circle of her own elite status. "I made a mistake," she said. Her voice was no longer icy or authoritative. It was resonant and surprisingly human. "I mocked you. I judged you by the uniform and the contract status. I assumed that because you didn't have a title, you didn't have a voice worth hearing." Daniel gave a small, humble shrug. "In a building with 2,000 people, the labels make it easier to get through the day, ma'am. I don't hold it against you. I was just happy to help the system breathe again." "Happy to help?" Marcus scoffed from the console, though his tone was now one of profound respect. "Daniel, you just saved the IPO. You just saved every person in this room's career. Why didn't you push harder before? You knew this was coming. You could have stopped this an hour ago." Daniel looked at the lead engineer, and then back at Elena. "Because people don't hear you until they need you, Marcus. That's just the physics of a boardroom. You were too busy being smart to be correct. I learned a long time ago that you can't force logic onto an ego that isn't ready to receive it. It just causes more friction." The room went cold. The directors looked at their shoes, feeling the weight of their own arrogance. Daniel had just diagnosed the entire corporate culture without ever raising his voice. "You aren't a technician, Daniel," Elena said, her eyes searching his for a truth she had missed. "No technician knows the routing layer of a global gateway like that. Who are you, really? Where did you come from?" "I'm exactly what it says on the contract, ma'am," Daniel replied. "A temporary support engineer. And more importantly, I'm a dad who is currently 5 minutes late for the most important robotics demonstration in the city. If there's nothing else, I really have to go. Gravity doesn't wait for anyone." He walked out. The elevator doors closed with a smooth, final hiss. Elena stood by the glass wall, watching as a man on a bicycle pedaled away from the glittering glass tower and into the heavy San Francisco traffic. She realized then that Daniel Brooks wasn't poor or unimportant. He was the wealthiest man she had ever met because he knew exactly what was worth his time. She turned to her chief of staff. "I want the full personnel file for Daniel Brooks, not the one HR has on the surface. I want the history. I want to know where a man with that mind came from, and I want him in my office at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Not as a contractor, as a partner. And make sure we have the best taco truck in the city parked outside." The freeze moment in that boardroom changed the DNA of Whitmore Tech forever. It wasn't just about the code being fixed. It was about a leader realizing that she had been building a company out of glass when she should have been building it out of the people on the ground. In reality, the most impactful people are often the ones who don't need the applause to do the work. They do the work because they value the work itself, not the recognition. The freeze moment isn't just about shock. It's about the uncomfortable clarity that comes when you realize you've been looking at the world through the wrong end of a telescope. The following morning, Daniel Brooks walked into the executive suite. He was wearing the same blue shirt and carrying the same worn backpack. He looked like the same nobody who had mopped the data 2 days ago. But as he passed the reception desk, the woman who had previously ignored him stood up and said, "Good morning, Mr. Brooks. Ms. Whitmore is waiting for you. Can I get you some coffee?" Inside the CEO's office, Elena was standing by the window. She had a thick, leather-bound folder on her desk. She didn't look at Daniel with the predatory gaze of a boss looking for a resource. She looked at him with the quiet, humble curiosity of a student. "I read your history, Daniel," Elena began. "The Astra project, the Global Gateway launch in 2012. You were the lead strategist. You were the vortex everyone in London was looking for 10 years ago. You were at the top of the world. Why did you walk away?" Daniel sat in the chair across from her, his posture relaxed and unburdened. "Because a VP title doesn't bake cookies on a Tuesday, Elena, and a 7-figure bonus doesn't help a 9-year-old with her fractions. I walked away because I realized I was winning at work and losing at home. I didn't want my daughter to grow up remembering her dad as just a voice on a speakerphone or a face on a magazine cover. I wanted to be real." Elena sat down, leaning forward. "I spent the night thinking about what you said, about people not hearing you until they need you. I've realized that my company is full of people like you, brilliant minds who are being silenced by the noise of the titles and the hierarchy. I want to change that. I'm establishing a new role. Chief of Operational Integrity and Human Strategy." She pushed a new contract across the table. 40 hours a week, hard stop at 4 p.m., full flexibility for robotics clubs and soccer games. You don't report to the board. You report directly to me. Your only job is to be the person who reminds us to look down at the foundation before we look at the IPO. You are the heartbeat of the system now." Daniel looked at the contract. He didn't look at the salary. He looked at the human values clause she had personally added in her own handwriting. He looked at Elena. "You're the first CEO I've met who actually learned how to listen to the silence. I had a very good teacher." Elena smiled, a real, genuine smile. Daniel took his own pen from his pocket and signed the paper with a steady, certain hand. He wasn't a nobody anymore, and he wasn't a somebody in the corporate sense. He was just a man who knew his value and had found a place where it was finally seen. As he walked out of the building that afternoon, he saw Emma waiting by the school bus. She ran to him, waving her cardboard car, the car that had won the Most Logical Design Award. "Did you get the job, Dad?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with hope. Daniel lifted her up, his heart feeling fuller than it ever had in a boardroom. "I got a better one, pal. I got a job where the boss finally learned how to follow the rules of physics, and she wants to come over for taco night next week. I hope you're ready for an audit of our hot sauce." Emma's eyes widened. "Is she nice?" Daniel laughed, looking back at the shimmering glass tower. She's still a CEO, Emma, but she's learning how to be a person. And that's a very good start. The story of the single dad and the CEO didn't end with a headline or a merger. It ended with a simple realization that real success isn't about reaching the top of the tower. It's about knowing who you are and who you love when you're at the bottom. Daniel Brooks was home, and for the first time in 5 years, the frequency was perfect. Value isn't something you demand with a title. It's something you provide with your presence. The strongest buildings aren't the ones with the best views. They are the ones with the most honest foundations. Never judge a person by the role they play. Judge them by the character they carry within it. True excellence doesn't need an audience. It just needs a reason. True excellence does not need an audience to exist. Never underestimate the quietest person in the room. They might be the only one with the integrity to hold the entire foundation together. Titles are temporary, but character is the only asset that never loses its value. If you believe that real skill deserves more respect than loud titles, subscribe for more stories like this. And tell me in the comments, have you ever been overlooked because you didn't have the right title? How did you prove them wrong?